At 3:53 in the morning on October 25, 1944, a battleship opened fire in the black waters of Surigao Strait. The first 16-inch salvo left her guns with a flash that lit the Philippine Sea for miles, and 22,800 yards away, a Japanese battleship began to die. The flash reflected off the low clouds. It lit the faces of sailors on her bridge and sailors on the bridges of the ships beside her. Many of those men had seen a flash like that before, in a different harbour, on a different morning, when the fire had come the other way. The battleship that fired first was the United States ship West Virginia. 2 years, 10 months, and 18 days earlier, she had been sunk at her moorings on Battleship Row. Her captain had been killed on her bridge. Over 100 of her sailors had died inside her hull, and 3 young firemen had been entombed in a storeroom deep below her waterline, where they would live for another 16 days in the dark before the last of the air gave out. On the night of October 25, the ghosts of Pearl Harbor came back to Surigao, and they came with radar. This is the story of the battleships the Japanese believed they had destroyed. The ships that were raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor, rebuilt in American yards, sent back across the Pacific, and finally given, on one night in the Philippines, the only thing the war could still give them. Not survival, not glory. A reckoning. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, 8 American battleships lay moored at Pearl Harbor. They were the pride of the United States Pacific Fleet, the iron core around which every American naval plan in the Pacific had been built for 2 decades. Arizona and Pennsylvania were Pennsylvania-class dreadnoughts. Nevada and Oklahoma were Nevada-class, the Navy's first oil-fueled super-dreadnoughts from a half-generation earlier. Pennsylvania herself was flagship of the entire United States fleet. Tennessee and California were post-Jutland designs with 12 14-inch guns apiece. Maryland and West Virginia were Colorado class, the newest and most powerful, each carrying 8 16-inch rifles, capable of throwing a shell weighing more than a ton out past the horizon. Together they displaced nearly 250,000 tons of steel. Together they mounted more than 70 heavy guns. Together they had not fired a shot in anger in 23 years. They were more than weapons. They were arguments. Every American child who had grown up in the 1920s and 1930s had seen their silhouettes in newsreels and magazines. They carried the names of states, and the states carried them back. When West Virginia had been commissioned, schoolchildren across her namesake had bought silver service for her wardroom. When Oklahoma sailed for the Pacific, delegations from Oklahoma City sent her quilts and flags and a copy of the state seal. These battleships were the Navy the country knew. They were the Navy the country trusted. They were the Navy that would, everyone believed, decide any Pacific war in one great daylight action somewhere west of the Philippines. The men aboard them were a reflection of the country that had built them. Farm boys from Kansas stood fire watches beside mechanics from Brooklyn. Sons of Norwegian immigrants shared berthing compartments with grandsons of Confederate veterans. Annapolis graduates who had read about Jutland as midshipmen drilled alongside mess attendants who were permitted only to cook and to serve. The crews were overwhelmingly young. The average enlisted man on a pre-war battleship was barely out of his teens. Many had joined the Navy during the Depression because the Navy offered 3 meals a day, a bunk, and a chance to see something other than a breadline. They had signed up for peacetime and gotten peacetime for most of the years they had served. They had painted and scraped and drilled and painted again. They knew their ships the way a farmer knows his fields. The world around them was already changing. The Battle of Taranto in November 1940 had shown what carrier aircraft could do to battleships moored in shallow water. The battleship Bismarck, in May 1941, had been crippled by torpedo bombers flying from the deck of the carrier Ark Royal before being finished by British surface ships. American war plans still called for a decisive fleet action, but the Japanese were quietly building a doctrine around the aircraft carrier, and a commander named Minoru Genda, air staff officer of the 1st Air Fleet, had been working for months on a plan that no American admiral believed was possible. The fuel oil in the tanks at Pearl Harbor was abundant. The sky above Oahu was clear. The crews had been at general quarters so often in recent weeks that the constant drills had begun to feel routine. On the morning of December 7, most of the Pacific Fleet battle line was tied up in a 10-acre rectangle of water on the east side of Ford Island, and no one on any of those ships expected the war to begin before breakfast. The day began like most Sundays on Battleship Row. The declog of Tennessee recorded moderate winds and scattered clouds. Church pennants had been broken out above the cage masts. On West Virginia, the band was preparing for morning colors. On California, the manhole covers of several compartments had been opened in anticipation of a material inspection scheduled for Monday morning, a detail that would prove catastrophic within the hour. On Nevada, a second boiler had been lit under the senior watch, a small decision that would make her the only battleship in the harbor capable of getting underway when the attack came. In the galleys, coffee was on. In the berthing compartments, men were writing letters home. On Maryland, a sailor named Leslie Vernon Short sat at his anti-aircraft station, addressing Christmas cards and loading belts of .50 caliber ammunition to pass the time. It was a blue, quiet morning of the kind that in memory always seems almost unbearable. Somewhere over the northern horizon, 183 Japanese aircraft were inbound, divided into horizontal bombers, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters. Their target lists had been memorized. Their torpedoes had been fitted with wooden fin stabilizers to let them run in the shallow water of Pearl Harbor. The pilots had been told that the American fleet would be sleeping. At 7:48 Hawaiian time, the attack began. At 8:03, a torpedo struck Nevada on the port bow. Within 2 minutes, 3 more torpedoes had hit Oklahoma on her port side. She began to roll. By 8:10, she was past the point of recovery, and her great masts were coming down into the harbor mud. Inside her hull, 429 men were trapped. At 8:06, a heavy armor-piercing bomb, converted from a 16-inch naval shell, penetrated the deck of Arizona near Turret 2 and detonated in her forward magazine. The explosion lifted the bow clear of the water. A column of smoke rose over 1,000 feet. On other ships, men felt the blast as a physical blow that staggered them against railings. 1,177 of Arizona's crew died in a single second, including her commanding officer, Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg, and Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, commander of Battleship Division 1. Nearly half of all Americans killed at Pearl Harbor died on Arizona in that instant. West Virginia took as many as 7 torpedo hits on her port side and 2 heavy bombs. A fragment from one of those bombs struck the bridge and tore open the abdomen of her captain, Mervyn Bennion, a Utah farm boy who had graduated 3rd in his Naval Academy class. Bennion refused to be moved. He continued to direct the defense of his ship as the deck beneath him filled with smoke and water. A mess attendant, named Doris Miller, who by rating and by the color of his skin was supposed to cook and wait tables and nothing else, helped carry his captain to shelter, then went to an unattended .50 caliber machine gun on which he had never been trained, and fired at Japanese aircraft until he was ordered off the bridge. Bennion died within the hour. Miller would live to receive the Navy Cross, the first African-American ever decorated with it, from the hand of Admiral Chester Nimitz himself. California was struck by 2 torpedoes under turrets 2 and 3, and then by a bomb that killed roughly 50 men. Her open manhole covers turned flooding that might have been survivable into flooding that settled her slowly to the bottom over the next 3 days. Nevada, under the command of junior officers because her captain was ashore, got underway and ran south down the harbor channel, streaming smoke, taking bomb after bomb. When she realized she risked blocking the channel, she beached herself at Hospital Point. Tennessee, pinned against the Keys by sinking West Virginia, was hit by 2 armor-piercing bombs that mercifully failed to fully detonate. Maryland, partly shielded by Oklahoma's overturning hull, took 2 bombs but only 4 dead. Pennsylvania, the flagship, sat in dry dock number 1 with 3 of her screws removed and took a bomb that killed 15 men and wrecked a 5-inch casemate. The 2 destroyers ahead of her in the dry dock, Costin and Downs, were torn apart by their own ammunition. When the last Japanese aircraft disappeared over the northern horizon, Battleship Row was a line of burning, flooding, and in some cases overturned hulks. 2,403 Americans were dead. The harbor was coated in oil from the ruptured fuel tanks, and the oil was on fire. Arizona was gone. Oklahoma was upside down. West Virginia was on the bottom. California was settling. Nevada was beached and listing. Of the 8 battleships the Pacific Fleet had owned that morning, only Maryland and Pennsylvania were still, in any meaningful sense, afloat and operable. Tennessee could not move until the Keys beside her were demolished. The Navy, the country knew, was broken before breakfast. The Japanese flew home, believing the job was finished. In the halls of Washington, senior admirals read the casualty reports and understood that an entire generation of battleships had been either destroyed or, at best, put out of the war for years. In Honolulu, salvage officers looked at the harbor and saw the impossible. And somewhere inside West Virginia, in a steel storeroom numbered A111, 3 young firemen named Clifford Olds, Ronald Endicott, and Lewis Costin heard the noises of the ship dying around them and, when the flooding slowed, realized they were alive. They had emergency rations, a flashlight, a Seth Thomas clock, and a calendar. They settled in, and they waited for someone to come. The United States Navy already knew what Japan did not. A battleship is a ship, and a ship can be raised. The decision to salvage the Pacific battle line was made within hours of the attack. On December 14, 1941, a formal salvage organization was stood up at Pearl Harbor. On January 9, 1942, command of the salvage passed to a 48-year-old Massachusetts Institute of Technology-trained naval architect named Homer Norman Wallin. Before the war was over, Wallin's divers would log approximately 5,000 individual dives, totaling 20,000 hours underwater. They would work in oil, in darkness, in bodies, in sealed compartments that no human being was meant to enter. They would raise almost the entire battle line. The conditions inside those hulls belonged to no engineering manual. Divers breathed through surface-supplied air hoses and walked in canvas suits weighted with lead boots. The water inside the sunken ships was a thick soup of fuel oil, lubricating oil, food from the galleys, paper, fabric, and the remains of crewmen who had not gotten out. Visibility was often zero. Divers worked by touch, mapping corridors and compartments they had never seen in life, memorizing the geography of a pitch-black maze by feeling with their gloved hands. Each dive could last several hours. The men came up exhausted, covered in oil that took days to wash off, carrying in their memories details they never spoke of afterward. The chief salvage officer at Pearl told a reporter that more than one of his best divers had walked away from the work after their first dive into a compartment where sailors had drowned. Those who stayed did so because they believed the work had to be done. They were paid civilian wages in most cases. They were not fighting men, but they did, on the inside of those hulls, what no soldier was asked to do. Pennsylvania and Maryland, damaged least, went west almost immediately. Pennsylvania came out of Dry Dock No. 1 on December 12, 1941, and sailed for the west coast on December 20. Maryland sailed with her and was back in fighting condition by February 26, 1942, the fastest return to service of any of the ships that had been hit. Tennessee had to wait until the sunken piers pinning her against the keys could be dynamited. She departed Pearl on December 20, 1941, in company with the other 2. Nevada was refloated on February 12, 1942, using a massive steel patch that covered her torpedo damage. California, after weeks of patching and pumping, came up on March 25, 1942. West Virginia, the most heavily damaged of the ships that would return, was finally refloated on May 17, 1942, more than 5 months after she had been sunk. It was during the work on West Virginia that the salvage crews made the discovery that still rides, decades later, through the memory of the United States Navy. Inside storeroom A111, adjacent to the fresh water pump room, they found the bodies of 3 young sailors: Clifford Olds, 20, of Stanton, North Dakota; Ronald Endicott, 18, of Aberdeen, Washington; Lewis Costin, 21, of Henryville, Indiana. They had sealed themselves in when the flooding came. They had consumed their emergency rations. They had opened the manhole to a freshwater tank and drunk what they could. And beside them, the West Virginia salvage officer, Commander Paul Dice, found a calendar. On that calendar, a red X had been marked on each day from December 7 to December 23, 1941. 16 days. 16 days in a steel coffin at the bottom of Pearl Harbor, counting time with the discipline of sailors while, on the surface, the nation thought the war had begun only minutes before. The calendar was forwarded to Washington. The families were told only that the men had died at their duty stations. Marine bugler Dick Fisk and other sailors on the overhauled ships reported, decades later, that the tapping they had heard from deep in West Virginia's hull on their night watches throughout December had not stopped until the 24th. That detail is impossible now to prove. What is not impossible to prove is the calendar. Commander Dice's own salvage report, dated May 1942, recorded it verbatim, and Dice kept the 8-day Seth Thomas clock that had counted the hours in A111. He later donated it to the West Virginia State Museum in Charleston, where it still runs. The calendar itself was later lost in the Navy's own archives. No one has found it in 80 years. Endicott and Costin lie today at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu. Olds lies in Stanton Cemetery in North Dakota. All three of their headstones give their date of death as December 7, 1941. The stones are wrong by at least 16 days, and the Navy has never seen fit to correct them. The 6 surviving battleships went to the shipyards of the West Coast to be remade. Puget Sound Naval Shipyard at Bremerton, Washington, handled the 3 big rebuilds, and it was there that West Virginia and California and Tennessee each spent many months being cut apart and reassembled. Mare Island and other yards handled the lighter work on the ships that had been less heavily damaged. What came back out of those yards over the next 2.5 years were not the ships that had gone in. They were new weapons, wearing old names. The 3 ships that had suffered the worst, West Virginia, California, and Tennessee, were rebuilt almost from the waterline up. Their old cage masts came off and went to the scrappers. Their twin funnels were trunked into one. New tower superstructures rose above their decks. Thick anti-torpedo blisters were welded to their hulls, adding 16 feet of beam. Their old dual batteries of 5-inch 25s and 5-inch 51s were torn out and replaced with 16 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns in 8 twin mounts, a radical improvement. Belts of 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon anti-aircraft guns covered every square foot of superstructure, and most importantly, the main batteries were married to a new Mark 8 fire control radar, a device that could find a battleship at 40,000 yards in total darkness and place a 16-inch shell on it, with an accuracy that no optical rangefinder had ever approached. Nevada received a less radical but still extensive modernization. She emerged in December 1942 with a consolidated superstructure, new dual-purpose guns, heavy anti-aircraft suites, and strengthened magazine protection. Maryland and Pennsylvania retained more of their pre-war appearance, because the urgent need for their firepower in the early Central Pacific campaigns ran ahead of any complete rebuild. Maryland kept her forward cage mast through most of the war. Pennsylvania kept her forward tripod and her older Mark III fire control radar through every battle she fought. None of these ships was what she had been in 1941. Every one of them was more dangerous. Nevada came out first. In May 1943, she led the American bombardment of Attu in the Aleutian Islands, firing on Japanese positions at point-blank range in the fog. She then returned to the West Coast for further work and sailed for Atlantic convoy duty, so she missed the next Aleutian operation. 3 months later, on August 15, Pennsylvania, joined by the newly rebuilt Tennessee and by Idaho, Mississippi, and New Mexico, covered the landings on Kiska, only to discover that the Japanese garrison had slipped away under cover of fog more than 2 weeks earlier. In November 1943, Maryland, wearing the flag of Rear Admiral Harry Hill and carrying the 2nd Marine Division staff of General Julian Smith, opened fire on Tarawa at 5 in the morning. Pennsylvania, Mississippi, New Mexico, and Idaho simultaneously bombarded Macon. On Mississippi that morning, a powder flareback in her No. 2 14-inch turret killed 43 men, a haunting echo of a 1924 peacetime accident in the same turret that had killed 48. Through January and February 1944, Tennessee, Colorado, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Mississippi, New Mexico, and Idaho shelled the coral atolls of the Marshall Islands. At Eniwetok, Tennessee, anchored 900 yards off the beach at Parry Island, and fired her 14-inch guns and her 40mm anti-aircraft guns at the same enemy positions. At Saipan in June, California took a Japanese shore battery hit on June 14, killing 1 and wounding 9. On June 22, Maryland was hit by an aerial torpedo in the bow, killing 2 and wounding 10, and was forced to withdraw to Pearl Harbor. On August 23, while steaming from Eniwetok toward Espiritu Santo, Tennessee lost her steering, veered out of line, and collided with California, tearing a hole in California's bow that killed 7 of her crew and sent her to the repair yard for almost 3 weeks. California missed the next operation as a result. At Peleliu in September, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Maryland, Mississippi, and Idaho hammered the Japanese garrison of the islands for days. Then came the Philippines. In October 1944, General Douglas MacArthur returned to Leyte Gulf, and behind him came the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. Covering the invasion, in a bombardment and fire support role, was Task Group 77.2, under Rear Admiral Jesse Bartlett Oldendorf, flying his flag on the heavy cruiser Louisville. His battle line, commanded by Rear Admiral George Weiler from the Mississippi, consisted of 6 battleships: West Virginia, Maryland, Mississippi, Tennessee, California, Pennsylvania. 5 of the 6, every one of them except Mississippi, had been at Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7, 1941. 5 of the 6 had either been sunk, beached, or set on fire by the Japanese attack. All 5 had come back from the mud. On October 17, they entered Leyte Gulf. For 7 days they shelled the beaches, their magazines emptied of the high-capacity bombardment shells they had been carrying for the invasion. And then, on the afternoon of October 24, American reconnaissance aircraft spotted a Japanese battle force approaching from the south through the Mindanao Sea, bound for the narrow throat of Surigao Strait and the transport anchorages behind it. At their head was Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, commanding battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, heavy cruiser Mogami, and 4 destroyers. 40 kilometers behind him, invisible in the radio silence, came Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima with 2 heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, and 4 more destroyers. The Japanese plan, code-named Shogo, called for these forces to burst through Surigao at night, annihilate the American transports, and turn the invasion into a catastrophe. Nishimura knew, by 1830 on October 24, that the center force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita had been delayed in the Sibuyan Sea. Kurita was supposed to burst through San Bernardino Strait to the north, at roughly the same time Nishimura burst through Surigao, so that the 2 prongs would strike Leyte together. Kurita was now hours late, and Nishimura's southern force had no carriers and no air cover of its own. He pressed on anyway. He had been ordered to. His only son, a young naval aviator, had been killed earlier in the war. A Japanese survivor later said Nishimura's strategy that night was that of a warrant officer, not an admiral. Oldendorf, reading the same intelligence, prepared a trap. At the northern mouth of Surigao Strait, where the narrow water opens into the Leyte Gulf, he drew up his battle line running east and west, across the track of the oncoming Japanese. He set his heavy and light cruisers on both flanks. He scattered 28 destroyers along the length of the strait for torpedo attacks. At the southern end, he stationed 39 patrol torpedo boats in 13 3-boat sections. His philosophy, as he put it later, was that of the old-time gambler: never give a sucker an even break. If his opponent was foolish enough to come at him with an inferior force, he was not going to give him an even break. Oldendorf had studied the old texts. Every American naval officer of his generation had learned at Annapolis that the supreme tactical achievement in fleet action was the crossing of the T, the maneuver in which the line of battleships passes perpendicular across the head of an advancing enemy column. When the maneuver succeeds, every ship in the crossing line can fire its full broadside at the enemy, while the enemy column can reply only with the forward guns of its leading ship. At Tsushima in 1905, Admiral Togo had crossed the T against a Russian fleet and broken it. At Jutland in 1916, Admiral Jellicoe had twice crossed the T against the German battle line, though the Germans turned away in time to survive. Oldendorf understood that Nishimura would be funneled by the geography of Surigao Strait into a column, and that the Japanese admiral, determined to reach the transports, would have no choice but to drive straight into whatever waited for him at the northern mouth. What waited for him would be the 6 guns of each American battleship arrayed broadside to his track, against the 6 forward guns on Yamashiro and the 6 forward guns on Fuso, and nothing else. The mathematics were not close. There was a complication. After a week of shore bombardment, the battleship magazines were low on armor-piercing shells and dominated by high-capacity bombardment rounds. West Virginia had only 200 armor-piercing 16-inch shells aboard. California had 240. Mississippi had 201. The others were similar or worse. Oldendorf ordered that the first 5 salvos fired from each battleship would be armor-piercing, loaded first in the hoists, and that fire would be held until the range closed to between 17,000 and 20,000 yards. At that distance, Mark 8 fire control radar would not miss. At 22:36 on the night of October 24, patrol torpedo boat 131, under ensign Peter Gadd, detected Nishimura's force on its surface search radar off Bohol. The battle had begun. Over the next 4 hours, American PT boats swarmed the approaching Japanese column. At 22:52, the Japanese destroyer Shigure opened fire on PT-152 and PT-130, damaging both. At 02:07 on the morning of October 25, PT-493 took 3 4.7-inch shells, killing 2 men and wounding 5. A petty officer named Albert Brunel stuffed his own life jacket into a hole in the hull and saved the boat from sinking. She limped to Panaon Island and grounded. PT-493 would be the only American ship lost in the battle. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Captain Jesse Coward's Destroyer Squadron 54 opened the first torpedo attack. 27 torpedoes in the water. 2 of them, fired by the destroyer Mervyn, hit the Japanese battleship Fuso on her starboard side. She slowed, she listed. Water began flooding progressively through her. 20 minutes later, the destroyer McDermott fired a spread that hit 3 Japanese destroyers at once. Yamagumo blew up and sank within minutes. Michishio went dead in the water, burning. Asagumo's bow was torn away. Morrison later called McDermott's spread probably the most destructive torpedo salvo of the entire war, and at 3:31, the destroyer Killen put a torpedo into Yamashiro herself. Her commanding officer, Commander Harry Corey, had set the torpedo depth to 22 feet specifically to match the deep draft of a Japanese battleship. It ran true. Fuso, the battleship that had spent most of the war with her sister as a training ship in the inland sea, capsized and sank at approximately 3:38 on the morning of October 25. Roughly 1,620 of her crew died. Only about 10 survived. For over half a century, American naval histories reported that Fuso had been blown in half by the torpedo hits and that both halves had burned on the surface for an hour. In 2009, the historian Anthony Tooley reconstructed the sinking from Japanese survivor testimony and concluded that she had simply capsized in one piece. In 2017, the research vessel Petrel, funded by Paul Allen, located her wreck on the bottom of the strait, lying upside down and buckled but unmistakably in one piece. Tully was right. The battleship that American sailors had believed they saw broken in half was a ghost built out of smoke and distant fires. At 3:53 in the morning, West Virginia opened fire. She was the first American battleship to shoot. Her Mark 8 radar had acquired Yamashiro at 41,000 yards. She fired her first full 16-inch broadside at 22,800 yards. She hit on the first salvo. 2 minutes later, California and Tennessee, both with Mark 8 radar, opened fire with their 14-inch guns. Maryland, with older Mark 3 radar unable to find the target directly, began firing by ranging on West Virginia's shell splashes. Pennsylvania, also with Mark III, never got a firing solution and never fired a main battery round for the entire battle. The line was drawn across Nishimura's path, exactly as Togo had drawn it at Tsushima and Jellicoe at Jutland. It was the last time in the history of the world that it would be drawn at all. The man who gave the order to open fire on West Virginia was Captain Herbert Victor Wiley of Wheeling, Missouri. Wiley was 53 years old that night, and he had the strangest career path of any battleship captain in the United States Navy. He had been a rigid airship officer. He had served aboard all 4 of the Navy's great airships, Shenandoah, Los Angeles, Akron, and Macon. On the night of April 3, 1933, in an Atlantic storm off the coast of New Jersey, the airship Akron had gone down. 73 of her 76 men had died, including Rear Admiral William Moffett, the father of naval aviation. Wiley was one of 3 men who survived. 2 years later, when Macon broke up and fell into the Pacific off Point Sur, California, Wiley was her commanding officer, and he personally pulled a crewman from the water before helping to evacuate the rest. He had earned the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for that. Early in the war, he had commanded a destroyer squadron in the Asiatic Fleet fighting through the Battle of the Java Sea before the Allied surface forces in the Western Pacific were effectively destroyed. He had taken command of West Virginia on January 15, 1944, when she emerged from the yards. He knew what it was to stand on the deck of a ship that was dying. He knew what it was to come home from a place where most of his shipmates had not. When the first 16-inch salvo left her forward turrets, the concussion shook the ship from keel to masthead. Sailors in the secondary battery positions described later the way the air itself seemed to compress, how the recoil travelled through steel into the soles of their shoes, how the muzzle flash left an afterimage floating in the dark. On the open bridges of the ships nearby, men watched the shells leave, a line of glowing dots arcing across the black sky, and knew in that moment that this was the answer. 22,800 yards away, the shells arrived on target approximately 1 minute after they had been fired. Mark 8. Radar tracked the fall of shot and fed corrections back into the fire control system automatically. The second salvo was on target, the third, the fourth. West Virginia was firing 16-inch armor-piercing shells at the rate of 1 broadside every 41 seconds, placing them into a shifting target at a range no battleship in history had ever hit a moving target. The Japanese sailors on Yamashiro reported later that the shells arriving from the darkness beyond their horizon gave them no warning. They could not see the ship that was firing. They could only see the shells. When the shells reached them, for 16 minutes, West Virginia and her sisters fired a combined total of about 285 16-inch and 14-inch rounds into Yamashiro and Mogami. West Virginia alone fired 93 rounds of armor-piercing. At the same time, the American cruiser line opened up on both flanks, Louisville and Portland and Minneapolis and Denver and Columbia on the left, Phoenix and Boise, and the Australian cruiser Shropshire on the right, all shooting with their 8-inch and 6-inch guns. At 4:02, a single 8-inch salvo from Portland struck Mogami's bridge and killed her captain, Ryo Toma, and nearly every officer on it. The gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander Giichiro Arai, took over the ship and tried to keep her fighting. There was, inside the American victory, one terrible moment. At 4:07, the destroyer Albert W. Grant, caught between her own cruisers and the Japanese return fire, took 7 Japanese hits and at least 11 American. Her doctor was killed. A radioman first class named William Selleck, both his legs blown off, said to the men trying to help him, "There is nothing you can do for me, fellows. Go ahead and do something for those others." Her commanding officer, Commander Terrell Nizwana, fired all 5 of his torpedoes and radioed that he was dead in the water and needed a tow. Grant would survive. 34 of her men would not. At 4:08, as Oldendorf ordered a ceasefire to sort out the confusion, Mississippi fired a single 12-gun 14-inch broadside at Yamashiro at 19,790 yards. That salvo, fired just as the ceasefire order was being transmitted, remains the last main battery salvo ever fired by one battleship at another in human history. The range closed no further. At 4:19, Yamashiro capsized to port and sank. Nishimura went down with her. Of her crew of roughly 1,600, only about 10 men lived. Behind Yamashiro came Shima, confused in the darkness, unaware that the force ahead of him was already destroyed. Around 4:30, his flagship Nachi collided with the burning Mogami. His torpedo officer, Commander Kokichi Mori, would tell American interrogators after the war that he had advised Shima to turn back, saying that up ahead the enemy must be waiting for them with open arms. Shima ordered withdrawal. On the way out, a torpedo from the American PT-137, which had been aimed at another target, caught the light cruiser Abukuma in the engineering spaces. She would sink the next day under Army Air Force's bombers off Negros. Mogami, crippled and burning, was scuttled by torpedo from the Japanese destroyer Akabono just after 1 in the afternoon of October 25. The cruiser Nachi herself would be sunk by American carrier aircraft in Manila Bay 11 days later. Japanese losses for the entire Surigao action came to roughly 4,000 men killed. American losses, in a night action that destroyed 2 battleships, a heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, and eventually 2 more ships in pursuit, came to 39 dead and about 114 wounded. Almost all of them were on Albert W. Grant or on PT-493. Morrison, writing after the war, concluded that in no battle of the entire war did the United States Navy make so nearly a complete sweep as in that of Surigao Strait, at so little cost. But the completeness of the sweep was not the only thing that mattered. What had happened at Surigao Strait was something that had never happened before and would never happen again. A line of American battleships, 5 of them raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor and rebuilt into ships their builders would barely have recognized, had executed the final successful crossing of the T in naval history. The line of battle itself, the formation of capital ships steaming in column that had defined great fleet actions since the wooden ships at Lowestoft in 1665 and through Trafalgar in 1805, Tsushima in 1905, and Jutland in 1916, ended at Surigao. The tactic was over. The age of naval warfare it had defined was over. And it had been ended by ships the Japanese had believed they destroyed. The battleships did not stop there. In January 1945, they covered the landings at Lingayen Gulf on the island of Luzon. It was a brutal campaign. On January 6, California was struck by a kamikaze at 1720, killing 44 and wounding 155. The same day, New Mexico was hit, killing her captain Robert Fleming, killing Lieutenant General Herbert Lumsden of the British Army, who was Winston Churchill's personal liaison to General MacArthur, and killing the Time magazine correspondent William Chickering. Lumsden is generally recognized as the most senior officer of the British Army killed in combat during the Second World War. On January 9th, Mississippi was hit at the waterline by another kamikaze, with 23 killed and 63 wounded. In February, Tennessee and Nevada supported the landings on Iwo Jima. West Virginia was among the bombardment ships. On February 21, one of her 16-inch salvos detonated a Japanese ammunition dump ashore, lifting Earth hundreds of feet into the sky. The next day, a small-caliber shell struck her near Turret 2 and wounded a sailor. She kept firing. In April came Okinawa and the worst kamikaze storm of the war. On March 27, Nevada took a suicide aircraft on Turret 3, killing 11 and wounding 49. On April 1, as the first Marines went ashore, a kamikaze crashed into West Virginia's superstructure just forward of a secondary battery director. The bomb passed through to the second deck without detonating. 4 sailors died, and more than 20 were wounded. She kept firing. On April 7th, Maryland was hit during the great kamikaze wave the Japanese called Kikusui-1. It was the same wave that had, the day before, sent the destroyers Bush and Colhoun to the bottom. On April 12, an HE dive bomber crashed Tennessee's portside anti-aircraft battery. 22 of her sailors died. More than 100 were wounded. She withdrew to Ulithi, repaired, and returned to combat on June 9. On August 12, 3 days before the end of the war, an aerial torpedo struck Pennsylvania at Buckner Bay, killing 20 men. It was the last significant combat damage taken by any major United States warship in the Second World War. Pennsylvania, which had been flagship of the entire United States fleet when the war began at Pearl Harbor, took the final wound. On September 2, 1945, the Japanese government signed the instrument of surrender aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Of the 6 battleships that had come back from Pearl Harbor, only one was there to see it. West Virginia rode at anchor that morning, the same ship that had opened fire first at Surigao, the same ship whose captain had died on her bridge in December 1941, the same ship in whose hull 3 young firemen had once counted 16 days with a red pencil. Of all the American warships at both Pearl Harbor and the surrender ceremony in Tokyo Bay, only West Virginia and the light cruiser Detroit were present at both. After the war, the end of the Pacific battleships came quickly and was in most cases unceremonial. Arizona remained where she had fallen, at berth F, 7 off Ford Island, and in 1962, on Memorial Day, a white concrete memorial, designed by the Austrian-born architect Alfred Price, was dedicated across her hull. It does not touch her, it spans her. She still leaks a small amount of oil into Pearl Harbor to this day, and the sailors of the Navy call those slow droplets the black tears of the Arizona. Of the 1,177 men killed aboard her, more than 1,100 remain entombed in her hull. She is the only Pearl Harbor battleship still visible on Earth, and the memorial above her draws over 1 million visitors each year. Oklahoma, after the long and brutal work of righting and refloating her, was found beyond repair. She was decommissioned on September 1, 1944, and sold for scrap. In May 1947, under tow from Pearl Harbor toward the breakers in San Francisco Bay, her tow line parted in a heavy storm. Roughly 540 miles out from the harbor, she had almost capsized inside. She slipped beneath the Pacific. She has never been found. Nevada and Pennsylvania were selected for the 1946 atomic tests at Bikini Atoll, Operation Crossroads. Nevada, painted bright orange as the aiming point for Test Able on July 1, 1946, was missed by about 700 yards by the air-dropped bomb. Both she and Pennsylvania survived the underwater test Baker on July 25, but both became so radioactive that neither could be safely reboarded. Pennsylvania was scuttled off Kwajalein on February 10, 1948. Nevada was used as a gunnery target by the battleship Iowa and a small fleet of cruisers and destroyers on July 31, 1948, off Pearl Harbor. She refused to sink under naval gunfire and was finally put under by an aerial torpedo dropped from a TBM Avenger. In May 2020, her wreck was located on the ocean floor at a depth of about 15,400 feet, lying upside down, her turrets torn off and scattered in a debris field around her. West Virginia was decommissioned on January 9, 1947, and scrapped at Seattle beginning in 1961. California and Tennessee were scrapped in 1959. Maryland followed them in the same year. The destroyer, named for Captain Bennion, the officer who had died on West Virginia's bridge, served with distinction through the rest of the war. The future aircraft carrier, named for Doris Miller, the first American aircraft carrier ever named for an African American and the first ever named for an enlisted sailor, is under construction at Newport News, Virginia. Beyond the steel, the salvage story has had a long second life. The story of Clifford Ronald Endicott, and Louis Costin was kept, for decades, only in Navy files and in the memories of the salvage officers who had gone aboard West Virginia in the spring of 1942. A Honolulu newspaper reporter named Eric Gregory brought it into public view in 1995. Since then, the compartment and its calendar have become part of the way the Navy teaches what sacrifice means. The families of the 3 firemen have received, over the years, letters from sailors whose own lives they have never touched, telling them that their sons and brothers are remembered. What the Pearl Harbor battleships did between December 7, 1941, and September 2, 1945, has no real parallel in American military history. They were, by any measure available to strategic planners in 1941, destroyed. They should have been monuments to a kind of warfare that had passed, as Jutland's dreadnoughts had become. Instead, a salvage operation that still ranks as the largest in human history pulled them off the harbor bottom. American industry rebuilt them into something that, in terms of firepower and electronics, was closer to the ships of 1945 than to the ships they had been before the war. And they went back out, one by one, and earned every battle star a Pacific campaign could give them. All 6 of them participated in amphibious operations without which the American victory in the Pacific cannot be imagined. And when the decisive moment came, on a night in the Philippines, it was 5 of those 6 Pearl Harbor battleships, plus one sister who had not been there that morning, that stood across the throat of Surigao Strait and erased the last Japanese battleship force ever to sail against the United States Navy. They did it with radar, at ranges no battleship in history had previously hit a target. They did it having fired the last salvos that one battleship ever fired at another. They did it having lost, to the enemy who had sunk them, a total of 39 men in the engagement. West Virginia, whose captain had been killed on her bridge by a Japanese bomb, opened fire first and hit on her first salvo. The men lost at Pearl Harbor did not come back. More than 1,100 still lie inside the hull of Arizona. Many of Oklahoma's 429 have been identified in recent years by forensic genealogy and returned at last to their families. The captain of West Virginia is buried in Salt Lake City. 3 firemen from her crew lie in Hawaii and North Dakota under headstones that record a date that is not true. But the ships themselves, all gone now to the breaker's yard or to the seafloor, did something between Pearl Harbor and Tokyo Bay that belongs permanently to the record. Every one of them is gone, except Arizona. She is the one who did not get to come home.